The British find themselves in the fight for their lives against the fierce Zulu kingdom. Their invasion into Zululand well underway, the British camp at the Sandawanda is now under heavy attack. Famed Zulu Horns of the Buffalo are quickly encircling a force of over 1,800 British, Colonial, and Natal native forces. Colonel Anthony Durnford, with his left arm paralyzed, gathered remnants of his No. 2 column, largely made up of cavalry, and that of the No. 3 column, largely consisting of infantry. Durnford hadn't found the commander of the No. 3 column, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline. He felt frustration, things unraveling too quickly, and thus he took it up upon himself to seize command of what little remained through the chaos unfolding around him. From his horse, he could see the oncoming horde of Zulu impi, their chants and screams for blood echoing around the Asandawana mountain. They would show no mercy, the hospital portion of the camp now being overrun. Those too weak to escape on foot, easy fodder for the Zulu assegai. He then looked back, saw the road, men running for their lives down it to escape back towards the Buffalo River and Rorke's Drift. He had to hold the road, Durnford concluded, and he spurred his horse, hollered to his riders, and had them dismount. He'd defend the road for as long as possible, for others to hopefully escape the Zulu onslaught, and there'd be no other route to withdraw. Durnford fired his pistol, then again, and again, one Zulu falling after the other. But for every warrior slain, it seemed 10 more would take his place. That's when he heard it, a massive roar off to his right. Durnford looked that way, could see a mass of Zulu impi appearing around the left flank of the mountain. This was the Zulu's right horn, and the realization hit Durnford stronger than any wound from a bullet or a spear. They were now cut off. Amongst the chaos of battle, Durnford noticed the world go dark, the sun seemingly disappearing and plunging the earth into night. A solar eclipse had begun, something the Zulus would see as a great omen. How could this have happened? The great British army not just being defeated, but slaughtered by an enemy inferior to them on almost all counts. It didn't really matter at this point, and Durnford readied to make his last stand. This is the story of the Anglo-Zulu War, focusing on the disastrous build-up to the Battle of Sandawanda and the following victory at Battle of Rorke's Drift. How could the British Army be defeated by such a force, the Zulu? What caused this disaster? Why was there a war in the first place? I've taken it upon myself to help answer these questions and give a comprehensive story about stubbornness, courage, political intrigue, and arrogance. Some names have been omitted for the sake of simplicity. Some characters which played a pivotal role in the build-up to the Anglo-Zulu War have been left generic, in the part to keep the story's main focus. This part is predominantly told through the eyes of 3 characters: Sir Henry Bartle Frere, Lord Chelmsford, and King Cetshwayo. These are their words, their actions, their thoughts as told by contemporary sources and a plethora of primary and secondary resources. All footnotes are going to be available on screen, and in the description is a full bibliography with links for further reading. I hope you enjoy this presentation of the dawn of the Anglo-Zulu War. A woman fled across the Buffalo River, exhausted and drenched in sweat, cloaked by the shadows of night to conceal her escape. She crossed into Natal, taking refuge at a police kraal. There, she thought she'd be safe temporarily, having now forded the Buffalo River and into British territory. For her kraal was not far off, just a few miles into Zululand. Another woman, around the same age, fled Zululand as well, crossing the Buffalo River to Rorke's Drift, where others provided her with care and protection. Both these women were wives of Zulu chief Cetshwayo, and they'd been caught having an affair with 2 younger Zulus. Having been discovered, they fled for their own safety, knowing that should Cetshwayo and his men capture them, they'd certainly be put to death. By 10 o'clock a.m., the first wife, who'd taken refuge in the police corral, was discovered. A Greytown correspondent reported the incident in great detail. Quote, "A large body of Zulus, some on foot and some on horseback, crossed the Buffalo and surrounded Mr. Robson's police corral. Some went into the huts and, after discovering her, dragged out the woman, while the others kept the men of the corral at a distance, pointing their guns at them and holding their assegais ready to stab them if they interfered. They seized the woman, knocked out all of her front teeth, tied reins to her neck and wrists, and so dragged her away about 500 yards along the ground. They had brought 2 horses, placed them close together, and laid the woman across their backs. In this, they brought her through the river. A short distance on the Zulu side of the river, a son of Cetshwayo killed her, and threw her body in a ravine."
Some reports claim that the Zulus marched into Natal with up to 300 men, but these numbers came from Bias Boer and British sources. Whatever the number, it was substantial enough to actually send fear through the local authorities. They did not dare impede upon the Zulus, in fear of being overwhelmed.
The second wife, now at Rorke's Drift, managed to last a few extra days, until that Sunday. Another column of Zulus crossed the Buffalo and into Natal. This time, she'd been discovered with her lover, who had also fled from Zululand. Quote, "They surrounded Rorke's Drift early in the morning, dragged the woman out, took her across the river, and shot her dead. The man was not harmed, successfully evading the Zulu party. He'd been seen as a male, and thus protected under British law in the eyes of the Zulu. However, the wives were regarded as Chief Cetshwayo's property, and thus they were denied the same protection. Their executions were ultimately carried out by one of Chief Cetshwayo's sons. In each instance, the Zulus refrained from directly harming local Natal residents or damaging property. By most accounts, the Zulus' sole transgression was crossing the Zulu-Natal border, not the abduction and execution of 2 women. The reaction by local Boers was immediate. Quote, "I should think after this, the Zulus must be put down with a strong hand. If not, we had better all clear out of this part of the country. Our lives are not worth a snap of the fingers." This author referred to the dogged and rabid fanaticism the Zulus had shown for their chief. 2 months later, on September 17th, 1878, another incident occurred between the Zulus and those of Natal.
David Smith was tasked by the Colonial Engineering Department to inspect a road by the Blood River. He viewed this assignment as particularly perilous due to the region's proximity to Zulu territory.
Despite these risks, the department declined providing him with a military or armed escort, leaving Smith to undertake the survey unprotected. The justification for no escort was also to not raise tensions with their Zulu neighbors. Smith was accompanied by W.H. Dayton, a trader and resident of the nearby Fort Buckingham. Most likely, this was done because of Dayton's familiarity with the area. Under the relentless South African sun, the 2 men crossed a ford, observing the stream's noticeably low water levels, a result of the region's prolonged drought, now in its 4th year. The pair, now mounted on horseback, decided the stream was shallow enough to cross. They did so, going down through the ford and trotting into the stream itself. Both these men, one being an engineer, the other a trader by profession, understood the danger of such an act in this part of Natal, because this ford marked the border with Zululand. Smith's fears were about to become reality.
On the opposite side of the border, a small band of Zulus spotted Smith and Dayton. The group advanced swiftly, remaining on their side of the river, until one of them called out, demanding to know the purpose of the pair's presence. Smith decided to ignore the Zulus and continue with his mission. Having gone into the river, they came to a drift and inspected the road leading across it. This spot was dangerously close to the actual Zulu border, and in fact many Zulus considered the entire river part of their territory, and not split down the middle. That was all the Zulus needed. They charged into the river and rapidly surrounded both Smith and Dayton. Again, these Zulus demanded to know their intentions, and seized them. The Zulus forced Smith and Dayton to empty their pockets, to which they obeyed, revealing they were carrying nothing out of the ordinary, to which the Zulus took the property as their own. During this commotion, a passing Zulu Induna, an esteemed Zulu leader, noticed the scene unfolding. He trudged over to those harassing Smith and Dayton and demanded they be released. As with the Colonial Engineering Department, the Induna likely sought to avoid escalating the situation into a full-blown conflict in worries of igniting a war between Natal and the Zulu kingdom. Under ordinary circumstances, such an event would have elicited little attention. In fact, Smith chose not to file a report whatsoever. Instead, D.H. Dayton took it upon himself to officially document the incident. The report eventually reached the desk of Natal's governor, Sir Henry Bulwer. Like Smith, he regarded the incident as of little consequence, and sent his findings to the High Commissioner of South Africa, Sir Henry Bartle Frere. Something Bulwer was obligated to do.
And here is where the ball starts rolling. Henry Bartle Frere was a divisive figure in South Africa, particularly for his advocacy of the South African Confederation under British governance, a stance that alienated both colonial and local populations alike. Despite strong oppositions from local officials and Boer leaders, Frere remained resolute in his push to consolidate British authority across the region. Inspiration in forming such a confederation possibly came from Canada, which had reacted to constant military raids from Irish immigrants, known as the Fenians, along the American border. Canada didn't just unify, but also greatly reformed their military to help handle the brief, but no less troubling, border crisis between them and the United States. Ever since Frere's arrival in 1874, this South African Confederation, while not his idea, became his primary objective. After all, he was anticipated being named the first governor of a unified South Africa under British dominion. On his desk sat a letter, a report from Sir Henry Bulwer. He read it and wrote a brief response, waving the incident off as Bulwer had. But he recalled there being a slew of recent border incidents between Natal and Zululand, namely the seizing of 2 women seeking refuge. And thinking back to this, Frere formulated a roadmap. Frere and many of his fellow British colonists never liked the Zulus, thinking them the primary obstacle to British dominance in the region. That, and the Zulus were considered nothing but warmongering, backward savages on all fronts, including their culture, military, heritage, and even the color of their skin. It was no secret that even the loyal tribes, such as those in Natal, were heavily looked upon as inferior, and therefore not as important for the progression of British interests. These 3 incidents, along with minor skirmishes along the Natal and Transvaal borders, convinced Frere that the Zulus were the root of the problem. The Zulu army represented the greatest threat of peace and prosperity in South Africa, and thus the primary wall stopping Frere's ideas of a South African Confederation. Even the Boers, who were the loudest opponents to British governance,
feared the Zulus more than they feared Anglo intervention into their sovereignty. Frere re-examined the dispatches sent from Henry Bulwer and began writing back with renewed interest. Summoning his staff and servants, he resolved to travel from Cape Colony to Natal and address the situation personally. His servants then prepared his luggage, and with a high-class horse-drawn carriage, Frere embarked on a journey across the South African plains toward Natal. A large banquet was held in Henry Bartle Frere's honor. Amongst the attendees was General Frederick Thesiger, dispatched to South Africa to safeguard the colonial population from perceived native threats. The general is better known to history by another name, Lord Chelmsford. He'd only recently inherited the title of Chelmsford, as Frederick Thesiger's father had passed away in early 1878. He'd been the commander of British forces in South Africa back in March of 1877, and by now he'd settled into the role with great confidence. He'd also achieved victory in the final of 9 border wars between Cape Colony and the Kawasa people, which settled the matter once and for all. Now, almost a full year later, he yearned to stretch his legs again. Having heard rumors of a possible Zululand invasion and the mounting pressure from other native states bordering Transvaal and Natal, he formally requested reinforcements. This request had fallen upon Frere's jurisdiction, and he seized the opportunity. The request was sent directly to London, describing the growing border problem. In Chelmsford's own words, he described the Zulus as being, quote, out of hand. Dressed in a highly ornate uniform, Chelmsford expressed in no uncertain terms the importance of military strength in Natal and Transvaal. Everyone knew the Zulus could rouse and assemble an army of up to 75,000 men, and currently neither colony had a proper defense. The Zulus could overwhelm one or both colonies, disrupting the tentative peace in South Africa. The fact the Zulus hadn't assembled such an army, nor showed any signs of launching an offensive, didn't matter. Chelmsford looked forward to reuniting with Frere, having previously collaborated during the 9th Cape Frontier War. They'd gotten along nicely, agreeing with a unified South Africa under their jurisdiction. But on the other hand was Natal's governor. Henry Bulwer had responded to Chelmsford's pleas with a cold shoulder. The Zulu were not about to invade Natal, and all Chelmsford could do was grumble. But he knew deep down he'd have his way. A band played festive music, games commenced, lavish food prepared, and champagne flowed amongst those in attendance. The guests and hosts donned their finest attire, striving to bring a sense of British nobility and civilization to the wild, untamed lands of South Africa. Many of the attendees wished eagerly to hear Bartle Frere. What was he going to do about the Zulu? What of the border? Were the British about to annex the Orange Republic too? So when Frere appeared upon a balcony, a deep silence followed, and all festivities stopped. They awaited the address, anxious to learn how the British government, might ensure the safety of Natal and Transvaal. They did not get their answers, nor explanations, nor assurances. As one attendee put it, quote,
Bartle Frere merely told his audience he came to learn what was wanted. The various speakers who followed were not slow to take the hint, and if Sir Bartle Frere can remember one half the complaints, suggestions, and recommendations given, he will have a wide field before him to operate on.
The lack of answers made it prevalent that Frere wasn't ready to spring his trap. If Frere hadn't said much, Chelmsford achieved the opposite. He openly advocated to Frere and to other key Natal figures for a more organized system of government. To Chelmsford, it didn't matter how many British soldiers could be shipped to South Africa. So long as the independent states outside of Cape Colony remained in relative autonomy, they'd be too disorganized to battle the Zulu. Only with a unified government could the Zulu kingdom be eliminated and assimilated into a greater South African colony. This aligned perfectly with Bartle Frere's agenda, and was exactly what he hoped to hear. Without a doubt, Frere wanted a war with Zululand. In his mind, such a war would not only answer the Zulu question, but also provide the perfect justification for a South African confederation. Henry Bulwer was perplexed by this blatant escalation of force. To him, the three incidents were insignificant. In his view, the Zulus were uncivilized barbarians, and such incidents were inevitable when neighboring such a nation. Starting a war with the Zulu would only invite disaster, and he spoke as such when Frere arrived in Natal. However, his stance was unacceptable to both the High Commissioner and Lord Chelmsford. Their minds were already made up, and their geopolitical ambitions were already in motion. Many officials in both Natal and Transvaal were skeptical of a war between the British and the Zulu. They thought negotiations over the border were already settled, and if not, they'd seek a dialogue with the Zulu king himself, King Cetshwayo. At a subsequent banquet held in his honor, Bartle Frere presented a righteous justification for declaring a war on Zululand. This was a blatant ploy to gain support from the religious factions within Natal and Transvaal, particularly among the Boers. At the head of a lavishly set table, one man rose to propose a toast to Frere's health. The rest of the table cheered, then drank champagne and an assortment of different wines. Frere smiled and stood, thanking his guests. Wealthy, aristocratic families from Natal whose names were largely established outside of South Africa. He acknowledged that there were tensions between Cape Colony and Natal, especially with regard to the Zulu question. But they were nevertheless one people. This notion furthered Frere's desire to unify South Africa under a single dominion. Since establishing themselves in Cape Colony, Frere claimed that it had been Britain's primary goal in spreading Christianity to the savages, and thus bring the natives into the folds of civilization. Frere wanted this with the Zulus, to elevate them from barbarians to respectable citizens. The hidden meaning behind this motivation wasn't lost to those at the table, nor those who'd been informed via letter by Bartle Frere. Unifying South Africa would guarantee that the white minority retained their power rather than the majority black population. The other was a direct response to Cetshwayo's resistance to Christian missionaries within the borders of his kingdom, an act he interpreted as a violation of Zulu heritage and culture. Bartle Frere's justification was met with a great applause, and it took only a few days for word to travel. The biggest problem facing Bartle Frere, despite newfound support from Lord Chelmsford, wasn't the Zulu at all. They would be an easy foe to defeat once war was declared. Instead, Frere faced steep opposition from the British government. In particular, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, a man who openly supported a British-run confederation in South Africa, but also didn't want another colonial war. Bartle Frere discovered a deep opposition to war with Zululand on October 11, 1878. Through the Secretary of State of the Colonies, Frere formally requested reinforcements for Lord Chelmsford's command. London refused this request. The letter from the Colonial Office read as follows, quote,
Her Majesty's government are not prepared to comply with a request for a reinforcement of troops. All the information that has hitherto reached them with respect to the position of affairs in Zululand appears to them to justify a confident hope that by the exercise of prudence and by meeting the Zulus in spirit, to avert the very serious evil war with Cetshwayo.
The Duke of Cambridge and the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army had also expressed befuddlement over Frere's desires. Quote,
My reports from Natal breathe nothing but peace, and I cannot discover that the colonial authorities have as yet organized, even on paper, any native contingent to fight the Zulu.
One afternoon, on a hot, sweltering day, a small band of Zulus herded their cattle along the Buffalo River. One of them eventually heard shouting, the rhythmic marching of men, and the blaring of bugles. Soon they stumbled upon thousands of British soldiers setting up camp and conducting drills. They marched back and forth with their distinctive red coats and tan pith helmets, others target practicing with their Martini Henry rifles. Even some of the artillery began to practice, making a show of not firing upon Zulu territory. There were also men on horseback, a curious mixture of Natal native contingent and imperial horsemen sent from Great Britain. This band of Zulu herders weren't the only ones to see a sizable British force, each stationed dangerously close to their border. In fact, numerous similar sightings confirmed that the deployment of soldiers was unquestionably deliberate. This fact unsettled the Zulus. Their assessment proved accurate, too. Lord Chelmsford had given an order to deploy his soldiers along places by the Buffalo River as a deliberate show of force. Sitting upon his throne, he'd established an Obdini, future Olundi. King Cetshwayo received the numerous dispatches on British deployment. Aware of Bartle Frere's growing interest in Zululand, Cetshwayo recognized the threat to his kingdom. Cetshwayo was an immensely proud man of his people, who he felt had lost their ways since the death of Shaka Zulu. Upon seizing power, he swiftly worked to restore and preserve the military traditions that formed the backbone of the Zulu nation. He thus rapidly expanded the Zulu army amongst his chieftains. Cetshwayo's legitimacy largely stemmed from prior British and colonial support. Despite a bloody rise to power, he secured enough backing to be officially crowned King of the Zulus in Queen Victoria's name. Not only did this add credibility to his own people, but also to the colonies rapidly surrounding Zululand. Cetshwayo's father had been the previous Zulu king, and he'd been viewed as soft. Cetshwayo was the exact opposite. Strong, tall, quite seasoned, and viewed by many as the first legitimate successor to the lionized Shaka Zulu. Nor was Cetshwayo an ignorant man. He carefully balanced neutrality toward the British and Boers, while asserting his role as a king committed to the independence and survival of Zululand, a territory spanning over 1,800 square miles. To this end, he mobilized an army of 40 to 50,000 Zulu warriors. He'd watch his rapidly expanding army and the embracing of old traditions with glee, until realizing a great folly in his own culture. By Shaka Zulu's own decree, warriors must not have families, because familial ties could distract them from their duty to fight. Thus, strict enforcement of male celibacy pervaded Zululand, which is why the infidelity of Chief Cetshwayo's wives with 2 young warriors became such a massive ordeal. Only by the age of 40 could a Zulu male marry and have children of his own. The only alternative was after the Zulu assegai had been washed with enemy blood. What did this mean for Cetshwayo? On one hand, it meant he'd always have a ready and aggressive army at his personal disposal. On the other, it meant that that army had a severe bloodlust. And Cetshwayo knew that a war with the British Empire wouldn't be conducive to the longevity of Zululand. The rapid annexation of Transvaal in 1876 became one of the final blows to King Cetshwayo's fragile trust in the Europeans. To many Zulus, including their king, this was a betrayal by the British, contributing to the constant border disputes along the Buffalo and Blood Rivers. War between the Europeans and other local tribes frequently resulted in the seizure of land promised to remain in native hands, further fueling Cetshwayo's distrust of Britain. One such war was the 9th Kocha War, starting in 1877. Cetshwayo naturally saw these British maneuvers as a direct threat to Zululand's sovereignty. Rising from his throne under the watchful eyes of his chiefs, Cetshwayo summoned several of the most seasoned and capable Amabutus, men in their prime for military service. Initially, his chiefs assumed this as a sign to invade Natal, but Cetshwayo quickly put an end to those thoughts. No. Instead, the Amabutu were to put on a series of grand and large-scale hunts. The chiefs understood the implications behind such an order. Cetshwayo demanded without direct dictation that his chieftains avoid provoking a war with the colonies while simultaneously reminding the British and Boers that the Zulu Impi stood ready to fight if necessary. That's where these large-scale hunts were to come in handy. Once the chiefs had left, Cetshwayo gazed upon his kraal, reflecting back to his coronation on that rainy September day, attended by many of whom he now considered the enemy. Major Anthony Durnford watched the unusual procession with curiosity. His uniform had become soaked by the rain, others standing beside him with umbrellas, including Bishop John Colenso, a man he'd come to consider a good friend. Durnford understood that Cetshwayo's coronation was a spectacle orchestrated by Theophilus Shepstone, the official responsible for Transvaal's future annexation. By crowning Cetshwayo king of Zululand, it would mean relative peace amongst the disputed borders. Durnford found this an excellent plan, having greatly enjoyed his stint in South Africa. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Durnford enjoyed the diverse cultures he'd seen, and also understood the necessity of using these people as a military force in protecting the colonies. While he still believed in the superiority of British rule, he displayed genuine admiration and respect toward the local black population, including the Zulus. He slipped his left arm into his pocket, saw the photographer preparing his camera, and stood beside the newly crowned king. A flash followed, the photo taken, and the coronation had been completed. He served as a mounted escort for Shepstone and Bishop Colenso. They'd done their duty, Shepstone seeming to dismiss the whole ordeal, but Durnford admired the Zulus, noting how the males never walked without their spears. These were fighting men, he knew, and would be fiercely loyal to their new Shaka Zulu. He overheard a conversation between Shepstone and Cetshwayo, where Shepstone offered a newly crowned king some advice. Cetshwayo's bloody rise to power was no secret, nor were the executions carried out by his loyal Indunas. Whether acting on their own or under his orders, they would not rest until Cetshwayo's rule was absolute, and they enacted hundreds of executions. Shepstone pointed out that such violence against one's own people was deeply frowned upon by the so-called civilized societies of the colonies. To preserve peace, it might be beneficial for the new Zulu king to halt these killings, or at least conduct them under the pretense of a trial. Cetshwayo, not a fool, agreed. However, his elimination of political rivals would only slow, never stop. On the way back across the Transvaal border, Durnford spurred his horse named Chieftain. They crossed a ford, the party leisurely making its way to Fort Napier at Pietermaritzburg. It's here Durnford learned of a rebellion of diamond miners, who were fleeing Natal and heading towards Basutoland. He was also to report directly to Colonel Thomas Mills. He'd been in the military since the Crimean War, but had never held true command. Would this be his chance? He certainly hoped so. Under Colonel Mills, Major Durnford was made Chief of Staff. Their force consisted of 2 companies of the 75th Regiment of Foot. These were well-trained British soldiers. Around 200 local colonial and Boer volunteers would also join them, but the majority of their command originated from the local black population. Around 2,000 men were pressed into service to assist the imperial troops in the arrest of the KwaZulu chief. Their mission was to prevent these rebels from escaping Natal. This meant that the rebels needed to traverse steep and rugged mountains. Mills would cut off the rebel retreat by sneaking around these mountains and essentially blocking their way. One large issue quickly made an appearance once Mills and Durnford began their march. They knew the location of the mountains, but hardly anything about the terrain itself. It is here Durnford got his wish. He was given a command of 55 Natal volunteers, likely armed with outdated Snider breech-loading carbines, and 25 horsemen from one of the local tribes who were largely armed with spears. To talk to his men, Durnford was forced to use an interpreter, making communications with NCOs a slow ordeal.
So Durnford had 2 large factors going against him. No one knew the ground in which they marched, and his men spoke a different language than him.
While on the march, Durnford's column lost their rations and much of their ammunition. He ordered a search party to detach, but they failed to return. Left without supplies, Durnford had his men share rations with the British forces under Colonel Mills, an act that drew jeers from the Imperial troops. Durnford had already been regarded with mockery for leading an almost exclusively black force on this expedition. Now his men had to share rations? The following day, Durnford's men traversed steep and rocky terrain, which began taking a toll on their horses. Soon the horses began collapsing from a mixture of heat stroke and exhaustion. It is here that Durnford's own horse became frightened and bucked the major off and onto the hard, rocky ground. He then found himself rolling, bucked off the side of a cliff, his body hitting rock after rock, tearing through the thick brush which sliced his skin. When he stopped, Durnford was overwhelmed with pain, thought he'd been stunned, instead finding he dislocated his right shoulder, cracked 2 ribs, and suffered a deep laceration on his head. When the medical team arrived, Durnford rose from the ground, refusing assistance. He forced himself back up the hill, where he wrangled back Chieftain, his horse. Mounting the horse once more, he displayed unwavering determination to complete his mission. Despite the pain in his shoulder and side, he and his small column pressed on. Their objective had been Bushman's Pass, a place they reached around 6:30 a.m. It is here that Durnford found precisely what he'd been searching for. Just below a small incline, dozens of refugees were tending to their cattle. This gave Durnford the perfect opportunity to swoop in and seize the moment. Quote,
"With 1 officer, 1 sergeant, and 33 rank and file of the carbineers, and a few bassettos, I had once formed them across the mouth of the pass. The natives in charge of cattle already in the mountain flying in every direction. Possibly there may have been 100 at the outside, about half of whom were armed and shooting weapons.
Durnford strategically positioned his men to prevent the refugees from easily escaping. He summoned his interpreter, the man appearing. Then they approached the natives. He called for their leader, and a hesitant man appeared, someone middle-aged, the strange man expressing that he was their chieftain. His body still in agony from the fall, Durnford ordered the chieftain to assemble his people. Once they did, he delivered his ultimatum. He assured them that if they submitted to British rule, they would be treated fairly, their wives and children kept safe, and their cattle spared. Quote,
My interpreter was recognized as one of Mr. Shepstone's attendants, and the Induna thanked me in the name of the people, saying they would all go down and tell my words to the tribe, who were not aware of the good intentions of the government and were afraid.
Durnford proved too trusting. When the chieftain turned his back, ostensibly to inform the tribe of the offer, men began taking cover behind the rocks scattered across Bushman's Pass. Durnford took command of the Carbineers on the left. Both these Carbineers and the Basutos advanced, where refugees shouted threats but refrained from attacking the soldiers. He heard shouting now, echoing, dozens of men appearing in the distance. Most were armed with spears and surged forward, prompting Durnford to order a brief withdrawal. He led his Carbineers out of the pass and up onto the nearest hill. There were gunshots now, too, natives firing old, wildly inaccurate muskets. But more of the enemy appeared, shouting, stabbing, shooting, using the rocks to help screen their movements. Even worse, he noticed the Basuto's troops had all fled in a massive panic, leaving his right flank exposed. Durnford now realized the gravity of his mistake. His force was now in grave danger of being encircled. Many of the Carbineers began to flee at the sight, but a handful remained, staying close to Durnford, following his orders, some even losing their lives to protect him. An act he'd never forget. But the disappearance of his Basuto's troops greatly angered him, because he knew that even if they were surrounded, his force had sufficient firepower to repel such an attack. But his men's inexperience led to much confusion and panic, leaving Durnford with one option: retreat. Rearing his horse, Durnford led his Carbineers out of the pass before they could be encircled. In the process, a spear had been thrown, striking the major directly in his left arm. Then came a whizzing noise, a bullet, the thing flying past him and grazing his neck. The wound in his left arm had also left it limp, and he struggled to use only his right hand to lead the others and himself to safety. Upon returning to the main column, Durnford was taken to a field hospital where news of the incident traveled along the camp. The ridicule was immediate, with claims that Durnford had lost control of his black troops and panicked. Adding insult to injury, the wound on his left arm had also left it paralyzed. 2 weeks later, the campaign came to an end. Durnford had recovered with ease, though his left arm would remain paralyzed for life. He'd gone to tucking it into his uniform, leaving a button undone, and he'd already mastered riding a horse with one arm. While he could no longer wield a carbine, he retained the use of his sword and pistol. During this time, Durnford received permission to organize a burial detail for the fallen at Bushman's Pass. With him rode his Carbineers, all of whom remained loyal to Durnford despite the ridicule from his peers. And for this, and their bravery during the skirmish, Major Anthony Durnford would always view these men with great respect and camaraderie. This loyalty became yet another thing Durnford's contemporaries would use to mock him. "5 years have passed now. and it was October of 1878. Durnford rode along the Buffalo River, carrying out his assigned duties. He was tasked with assessing the feasibility of crossing the river in the event of war between the Zulus and Natal. He'd been appointed the commanding Royal Engineer of Natal, and now he watched the river, recalling he'd once been a part of the commission designed to negotiate the border with Transvaal, Natal, and Zululand. He turned to his cavalry, many of whom being the same carbineers of his previous excursion. He lobbied persistently for the creation of an African Pioneer Corps, an idea met with significant resistance. But eventually, Durnford succeeded, and 2 companies of Natal native pioneers were formed. Encouraging news followed as rumors of war spread across Natal. Anticipating war between the Zulu Kingdom and the British, Durnford was pleased to see the native pioneers grow into 3 regiments. They'd been dubbed the Natal Native Contingent. This was approved directly by both Henry Bartle Frere and Lord Chelmsford. Durnford rode with his native contingent and knew most were not proper soldiers, but he never proposed them to be so. These men were intended as skirmishers, providing additional manpower for a potential invasion of Zululand, and the more time passed, the more likely that seemed a reality. Despite past defeats, Durnford took pride in leading this new native contingent. Durnford and his scouts discovered several places along the Buffalo River that were suitable for an army to ford. The most promising site was near Rorke's Drift, a place central to the brewing conflict. He was satisfied with his reconnaissance and rode back to his camp, where he was greeted by cheers from his men. Unlike many British officers who balked at leading predominantly black regiments, Durnford embraced the role wholeheartedly. He'd not forgotten his brave carbineers, and now used them to help organize and raise his Natal native contingent. While others under Chelmsford had no faith in his men, Durnford did, especially his cavalry, who proved quick to ride and expert marksmen. So long as Durnford showed faith in them, they'd show faith in him. These carbineers would be dubbed the Natal Native Horse. He kept his engineering corps nearby, anticipating Chelmsford's army would need bridges to cross the Buffalo River. He knew that it wasn't a matter of how a war between the British and Zulu would begin, but when.